It was a quiet evening at the restaurant, the kind of night where everything just fell into place. The kitchen hummed with the comforting sounds of sizzling pans, the rhythmic chop of a knife against the cutting board, and the low murmur of conversation drifting in from the dining area. Chef Daniel wiped his hands on his apron, glancing at the clock. Almost closing time. He had always loved these last few moments before the night ended, when he could finally take a breath, enjoy the lingerings, aroma of spices in the air, and watch his staff share tired but satisfied smiles. But that night, something felt different. There was a weight in the air, an uneasiness he couldn't quite place. Just as he was about to step out of the kitchen, he noticed a small figure standing near the entrance. A little boy, no older than 7 or 8, dressed in worn clothes, and shivering slightly in the cold evening air. His dark eyes flickered with hesitation, darting around as if he wasn't sure whether he should step inside or run the other way. Daniel hesitated. The restaurant wasn't a shelter, and he had learned over the years that getting involved in strangers' problems could sometimes invite more trouble than he was ready for. But something about the boy tugged at him. The way he clenched his tiny fists as if bracing himself for rejection. The way his shoes, too big for his feet, looked like they had walked more miles than they should have. With a sigh, Daniel walked toward the entrance. "Hey there, buddy," he said gently, crouching down to the boy's level. "You lost." The boy shook his head, but said nothing. Daniel glanced around, looking for an adult, a guardian, anyone who might be with him. But the street was quiet, too quiet. Something told him this child wasn't just passing through. Then just as he was about to ask another question, a sudden noise shattered the stillness. A woman's voice, panicked, desperate. "Help!" Daniel turned sharply, his heart pounding. Across the street, a heavily pregnant woman in a police uniform was struggling with something, someone. A man, his face twisted with anger, was trying to grab her. His hands locked around her wrist as she fought to break free. Without thinking, Daniel surged forward. He had no idea that this one moment, this one decision to step in, would change the course of his life forever. And he never imagined that the little boy standing at his door would be the one to save his family when he needed it most. Daniel didn't think. His feet moved before his mind could process what was happening. The little boy remained frozen at the restaurant door, his wide eyes locked on the scene, unfolding across the street. As Daniel sprinted forward, the woman let out another cry, struggling harder against the man gripping her wrist. Her other hand was clutching her stomach protectively, her uniform slightly wrinkled from the struggle. "Let go of her!" Daniel shouted, his voice cutting through the night air. The man turned his head sharply, his face partially hidden by the shadows. There was something wild in his expression, something desperate. But for a moment, his grip loosened, just enough for the officer to wrench herself free. She stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps, one hand still on her belly. Daniel positioned himself between them instinctively. He wasn't sure what he was dealing with. Someone trying to hurt her. Someone she had been trying to arrest. But there was no time to ask questions. The man glared at them both, his fist clenching as if he was considering another move. Then, suddenly, he turned and ran. The officer swayed slightly, her face pale. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Daniel asked quickly. She nodded, though she looked shaken. Yeah, I think so." She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "That man, he's been following me. I didn't think he'd actually try to." She stopped, pressing a hand to her forehead. "I should call it in." Daniel nodded, stepping back. But before either of them could move, a small voice spoke up. "He was watching you before." the little boy said. Both of them turned. Daniel had almost forgotten about him in the chaos. But now, the boy stood just a few steps away, still clutching his arms to his chest. His voice was quiet, but certain. He was outside a long time, he added. Before you even came out here. The officer frowned. You saw him. The boy nodded. Daniel exchanged a look with the woman. There was something unsettling about the way the boy said it, something that made the hairs on the back of Daniel's neck stand up. What's your name, kid? Daniel asked gently. The boy hesitated, shifting on his feet. Mason, he said after a moment. Mason, where are your parents? The officer asked, her voice softer now. The boy hesitated again, glancing away. Daniel had seen that look before, the kind that meant there was no one coming for him. He sighed. Listen, why don't we go inside? It's cold out here. The officer hesitated, but eventually nodded. I need to make a report anyway, and I need to sit down. Back inside the restaurant, the air was warmer, more familiar. Daniel grabbed a chair for the officer, who sank into it with a tired sigh, while Mason hovered near the entrance, as if afraid to step in too far. You hungry? Daniel asked, already knowing the answer. Mason nodded, but quickly added, I don't have money. Daniel waved him off. It's on me. As he moved toward the kitchen, he heard the officer speaking quietly into her radio, reporting what had happened. He could still hear the shake in her voice, but she was trying to keep steady. Few minutes later, Daniel placed a plate in front of Mason. The boy hesitated for only a second before grabbing the fork, eating like he hadn't had a meal in days. Daniel leaned against the counter, watching him. So Mason, he said carefully, where were you before you came here? Mason slowed down, pushing his food around with his fork. Nowhere, Daniel sighed. He knew when a kid was avoiding a question. He had been that kid once. The officer spoke up. Mason, do you have somewhere to go tonight? The boy's shoulders tensed, but he didn't answer. Daniel felt something in his chest tighten. He didn't know this kid, but something about him felt familiar. Before he could say anything, the restaurant door opened again. This time, 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. The pregnant officer sat up a little straighter. You okay, Officer Carter? One of them asked. She nodded. Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired. One of the officers turned to Daniel. You the one who helped her? Daniel shrugged. I guess. The officer gave him a nod of appreciation before his eyes landed on Mason. And the kid? Officer Carter glanced at Mason, then back at her colleagues. He saw the guy before I did. Might be useful for the report. The officers exchanged a look before one of them kneeled down in front of Mason. Hey, buddy, he said, voice calm. Can we ask you a couple of questions? Mason didn't respond. He only looked at Daniel. Daniel sighed. You can trust them, kid. Mason looked unsure, but after a moment, he nodded. As the officers spoke with Mason, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man who attacked Officer Carter hadn't just been a random guy on the street, and Mason had been watching before it even happened. Something told Daniel that this night was just the beginning of something much bigger. As Mason sat with the officers, answering their questions in quiet, careful words, Daniel couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his gut. Something was off. The way the boy had appeared at his restaurant door, the way he had noticed the man lurking before the attack even happened. It was all too connected. Officer Carter watched Mason closely as he spoke, her hands resting protectively over her stomach. She still looked pale, shaken. Whatever had just happened to her, she knew it wasn't random. Then, Mason said something that made the whole room go still. He wasn't just watching her, Mason murmured. staring down at his empty plate. He was waiting for her. The officers exchanged a sharp glance. "What do you mean, kid?" one of them asked. Mason swallowed, his fingers tightening around his fork. "I've seen him before, a few times. I think he's been watching her for days." Daniel's pulse quickened. "Where, Mason?" "Near the police station," he said quietly. "Outside, in a car sometimes. He just sits there." Officer Carter's face darkened. She took a slow breath, trying to steady herself, but the tension in her jaw was obvious. One of the officers grabbed his radio. "We need to check surveillance around the station. Now!" The realization hit Daniel like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't some random guy attacking a cop. This was planned. As the officers spoke in hurried voices, Mason stared down at the table, his small fingers pressing into the wood. Daniel could see the fear in his eyes. "You okay, kid?" he asked gently. Mason hesitated before nodding, but Daniel wasn't convinced. Then Mason whispered, "I think he saw me too." Daniel felt his stomach drop. Before he could respond, the radio on one of the officers crackled. A voice came through, tense. "Suspect identified. Name matches an ex-cop. Fired last year after multiple complaints. Last known address is 5 blocks from your location." Officer Carter's face paled further. "He was a cop?" "Yeah," the officer responded grimly. "And he's dangerous." Everything happened fast after that. The officers rushed out, calling in backup, leaving Daniel and Mason alone in the now empty restaurant. The night felt eerily quiet again. But this time, the silence was thick with something else. Mason shifted in his seat. "Am I in trouble?" Daniel shook his head. "No, kid. You might have just saved her life." Mason looked down again, his face unreadable. A few minutes passed, stretching long and uncertain, before Officer Carter returned. She looked exhausted, but relieved. "They got him," she said, exhaling heavily. "Found him near his place, trying to run. He had notes, pictures of me, my home, my car." She shook her head, trying to process it. He was planning something worse. Daniel exhaled. "Glad they got to him first." She nodded. Then her eyes landed on Mason, her expression softening. "And this little guy helped stop it before it got worse." Mason shifted uncomfortably. "I just saw stuff. That's all." Daniel placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "That's not just." "Anything, kid." Officer Carter crouched beside him. "Do you have anyone to go home to, Mason?" The question hung heavy in the air. Mason bit his lip. He didn't answer right away. Finally he mumbled, "No." Something passed over Officer Carter's face. A quiet understanding. Daniel saw it too, and he felt something deep inside him shift. "You do now," Daniel said. Mason looked up, confused. Officer Carter smiled. "He's right, Mason. We're not just gonna let you walk back into the night alone." The boy blinked, as if struggling to believe what he was hearing. Daniel sighed, ruffling Mason's hair. "Come on, kid. Let's get you home." For the first time that night, Mason smiled, just a little, and as they stepped out of the restaurant into the night, Daniel realized something. Maybe he had saved someone tonight, but in some way, Mason had saved him too.